As works for and by women are actively being suppressed by the government, it is important to uplift artists who use their platforms to promote the visibility of their intersecting identities. Pia Camille and Pepe are two artists that utilize historically women's techniques as the primary creation force of their works. These works show how public art installations that are made using the techniques and materials associated with women's work generate and promote feminist visibility, defiance, and community. In Pia Camille's Air Out Your Dirty Laundry or Saca tus trapos al sol, clotheslines were hung between the flagpoles in the courtyard of Rockefeller Center from May 4th to June 24th, 2022. They occupy the place of the 193 flags that typically occupy that setting. These clotheslines are full of over 700 used clothing and textile items donated by the residents of Mexico City. The clothing items are placed together as the outfits of the people who donated them and in their given condition. The items come in every color and every type: pink pants, striped shirts, sports bras, quilted blankets, etc. Just 1 year later, Pepe's My Neighbor's Garden overtook the entirety of Madison Square Park from June 26 to December 10th, 2023. She created architectural elements such as wooden posts topped with large metal discs, which she related to telephone poles. These acted as a support system and base of the work. Then, draping from post to post lived the fiber elements of large masses of crocheted drapery. These crochet vines are made of shoelaces, gardener's nylon twine, paracord, and rubber bands. They were made in various colors: hot pinks, purples, reds, and oranges, all of which were in direct contrast to the greenery of the plants in the park. Pepe and Camille use crochet and textiles as the primary mediums for their installations. These two mediums have historically been associated with women's work. The term women's work has been used to describe many types of labor which has historically been done by women. It comes in forms of sewing, mending, cooking, cleaning, and more. This labor is most often unpaid, as it is seen as obligatory for the quote-unquote women of the house. This social model, where men leave for work while women stay home, has for many generations become less popular as women join the workforce. However, while women may be leaving the house for work, they are also expected to do this obligatory labor once they return home in the evening. In a 2021 study from the Pew Research Center, heterosexual couples were surveyed, and when they were asked who did most household chores, 59% of the women surveyed claimed they did. Due to the immense time and skill that this labor requires, by tracing it backwards, we can see how it established the roots for the development of many crafts and trades, crochet among them. These crafts, in turn, gave way to mediums and art forms that would largely go unrecognized by the fine arts field until the 1970s, when women like Miriam Shapiro brought these forms into a new light. Shapiro coined the term femage to encapsulate these artworks and techniques that were previously isolated to the world of craft. She defines femage as, quote, a word invented by us to include all of the following activities as they were practiced by women using traditional women's techniques to achieve their art: sewing, piecing, hooking, cutting, appliquing, cooking, and the like. Activities also engaged in by men, but assigned in history to women, end quote. These activities she refers to are as follows: collage, assemblage, decoupage, and photomontage. These are four distinct art forms, yet all of them include two key characteristics that Shapiro uses as criteria to categorize works as femage. Those characteristics being the collecting of scraps and the stitching, literal or otherwise, of said scraps together. This is Shapiro's Children of Paradise from 1983. It is a collage as well as a lithograph. As such, there are many varied editions of this print. The variety of prints do a wonderful job of showcasing Shapiro's skill with color, as well as demonstrating her vast variety and use of collected materials. She used laces and textiles to achieve contrasting textures, as well as different paper scraps to provide the variety of patterns seen throughout. This is Crocheted Environment. It was done by Faith Wilding in collaboration with Shapiro and Judy Chicago's Project Women House. This work, which is most often referred to as Womb Room, was done in 1972 and is an early example of large-scale femage. Its legacy can certainly be felt in Camille and Pepe's installations. Femage mediums were originally used in the creation of items for audiences of what Shapiro called intimates. These intimates were family members or friends who would innately benefit from the work. Shapiro asserts the importance of femage as it highlights this incredible work done by women that has long been practiced in private, yet kept out of mainstream art conversation. So what does it mean when these techniques are placed in a public setting for all to see? As stated before, an important aspect of femage is that of recycled materials or scraps. As Shapiro would say, quote, "Women have always collected things and saved and recycled them because leftovers yielded nourishment in new forms," end quote. These elements can be seen in the installations of Pepe and Camille as both artists use recycled or otherwise recontextualized materials. In My Neighbor's Garden, instead of typical cotton or wool yarn, Pepe uses shoelaces, nylon twine, paracord rubber bands, and garden hoses for the main crocheted vines in her work. In this image, we can see how she incorporates bright purple hoses that are joined together to create one large organism that coils around the light post. These materials also serve a practical purpose as they will last in the changing weather of the park far better than the materials traditionally used in this medium. In Air Out Your Dirty Laundry, every item was loved and lived in prior to being donated and then recycled into Camille's work. Camille keeps these clothes in their given condition, leaving that person's lived experience intact along with the clothing. This helps show that individual's style and expression and gives that person a platform on which to be visible. Promoting visibility and bringing women's art to the mainstream is an ongoing mission for feminists in art. Linda Nochlin asks, quote, "Why have there been no great women artists?" End quote. This question highlights the systematic exclusion that is faced by women within the field of art. This exclusion has been combated by feminists for generations now, and multiple tactics have been used. Griselda Pollock claims that while pointing out the discrimination against women and their omission from the historical canon is essential, the methods we use to call attention to it can have limiting results. She says, quote, "Courses on women in art are occasionally allowed in marginal spaces which do not replace the dominant paradigm," end quote. This meaning that the information provided by these classes that focus solely on women's art or niche feminist topics are only accessed by a small group of people who seek out that information. This may not have the same impact that including art by women in general courses would have. The proclamation of socially constructed gender and sexual difference is essential, and once we assert that in the mainstream, then the paradigm can change. By bringing works like these to the public directly, it helps in expediting that change. As people need not seek out courses to see the works, they only need to go outside. Ephemeral or temporary public works provide an opportunity for members of the public to engage in discourse and conversation about topics relevant to the contemporary moment. In her essay, Temporality in Public Art, Patricia C. Phillips argues for the importance of impermanence in public art by saying, quote, "Ephemeral public art provides a continuity for analysis of the conditions and changing configurations of public life without mandating the stasis required to express eternal values to a broad audience with different backgrounds and often different verbal and visual imaginations," end quote. In other words, temporary public works provide insight into the ideas and feelings of a specific person or group at a specific moment in time. This makes them more insightful and relevant for the audiences that view them. By installing public works that vastly contrast their surroundings, it further aids in them leaving lasting impacts on their audiences. These works stand in defiance to the structures surrounding them. To the left is a monument in Madison Square Park dedicated to Admiral David Glasgow Farragut, and to the right, we see Pepe's installation with its lively hot pink crochet against the green foliage of the park. Pia Camille's lines of laundry contrast immensely against the dominating Rockefeller Center and New York City at large, as clotheslines are illegal in multiple of the city's boroughs. These contrasts draw the eye and make the viewer think about what it means for these installations to be where they are. And due to their historically feminine mediums, it leads the audience to draw a connection between femininity and the power commanded by these works. By placing these works at a level where people must crane their necks to get a better view, the artists are demanding respect and recognition, much like statues on podiums or flags on poles. The mode of production for both of these installations centers community engagement, as these works came to be by the actions of communities the artists both created and inhabited. Shapiro describes the importance of camaraderie between women in art making by saying, quote, "Privately held feelings imagined to be personally held hang-ups turn out to be everyone's feelings, and it becomes possible to act together in their solution, if there is a solution. What formerly was considered trivial was heightened to the level of serious art making," end quote. This image shows a group of people that volunteered their time, skill, and labor to help Pepe create her work. Communities like these are especially vital now as we face obstacles that appear to grow higher every passing day. By bringing people together around a common purpose, these works help validate their experiences and motivate them to go forth and continue to make change. Thank you.
The artwork of Alison Knowles and Daniel Spoeri situates itself uniquely within the realm of the everyday. Both examine the unique power that daily existence holds. Knowles' The Identical Lunch and Spoeri's Snare Pictures meditate on the ordinary existence of daily life as an art practice and the process of actively engaging in everyday activities as a tactic for subverting dominant power structures, highlighting how daily life can be a tool for regaining autonomy when analyzed within the context of Henri Lefebvre and Michel Desserteau's theories of everyday life. As a member of Fluxus, Alison Knowles' work has consistently pushed the boundaries of what defines art. Following the aims of Fluxus artists like Dick Higgins and George Machunas, among others, Knowles consistently blurs the distinctions between art and life. She is well known for a practice of using food as material for artwork, and when looking at her work, one can conclude that the only constant definition of art for Knowles is that it is intentional, intentionality being the conscious process of transforming a simple ritual into a work of art. Knowles says of The Identical Lunch that the conscious action of eating the same sandwich, a rather mundane activity, created the potential for changes in perception, as in the regularity of life becoming a personal performance. The Identical Lunch begins with a score, essentially instructions on how to perform the work, which Alison Knowles writes on the very first page in her journal of The Identical Lunch. Quote, "The Identical Lunch, a tuna fish sandwich on wheat toast with lettuce and butter, no mayo, and a large glass of buttermilk or a cup of soup," end quote. The ingredients of The Identical Lunch are standard American diner fare, giving the artwork agency to be performed anywhere by anyone, which Knowles encouraged from its inception. She extended invitations for reenactment by many of her Fluxus peers, these reenactments being crucial towards defining the lunch as an ephemeral work that isn't tied to one artist or to institutions, and opening the doors for participation of others to inhabit a system, but bending it to personal or subversive ends. Knowles' Journal of the Identical Lunch recounts her experiences while performing the piece, detailing her observations while eating the same tuna sandwich every day from 1968 to 1969, as well as the written observations of her peers performing the score, which sometimes differ wildly from Knowles' own, Knowles' entries often being succinct and almost exclusively descriptive of interactions she had with patrons and or employees of the restaurant. Knowles' peer Jim Maya writes in the journal, quote, "When you've finished, you hardly know you've eaten." The Identical Lunch is to be meditative, to drag a performer out of the mundanity of a midday meal and into a mental space of contemplation and utter awareness of action within one's everyday life. As in Knowles' work, Spoeri's practice often uses food as material for creation, and in 1960 made his first snare picture, which is a tabletop that acts as a canvas that displays adhered materials, diningware, food scraps, utensils, and others glued to the surface from a previous dining experience. Tableau Piège Série number 16 from 1991, the snare picture from Daniel Spoeri, may perhaps be one of the most chaotic and dynamic of his tabletops, representing quite an exquisitely busy dinner between friends. In this snare pictures, our eyes are first and foremost drawn to the large number of plates and glasses on the tabletop, signaling a busy dining experience, one that may have lingered for quite some time, way past the act of eating. This feeling of a long drawn-out dining experience is additionally exemplified by the two ashtrays on either end of the table, whose bottom surface is almost completely covered in cigarette butts. The plates remain dirty, and so do the bottles of wine and glasses, covered in residue from what assumably came from the serving dish in the middle of the table. Bread and utensils are strewn about the table in an unconscious fashion, leaving the viewer to conclude that those who ate here were much too preoccupied with lively conversation to be bothered by any sense of organization and cleanliness of their dining space. While everything in this artwork aligns with a particularly earthly color palette, The bright red and one orange napkins engage the eye and assist the viewer's enjoyment of the artwork, not only adding a pop of color, but adding another morsel of dynamism to this random arrangement of objects, which is compounded by the crumpled up, non-uniform nature that these napkins exist in, again suggesting the engagement with community without regard to anything else in the moment at hand. The physical snare picture, however, simply acts as a part of the entirety of what makes up the work of art. Dorota Kazanowicz mentions in her book, The Aesthetics of Taste, Spoerry's process of creating the artifact is just as important as the process from which it stems. Kazanowicz says, quote, Spoerry's first eating performances were also staged in Paris, where he opened a restaurant called Galerie J in 1963. The venue operated from the 2nd to the 13th of March and hosted over those 10 days 10 original meal events, which at the same time provided the materials for new snare pictures, end quote. These dinner performances involved art critics acting as waiters, Spoerry acting as the chef, cooking every meal and constructing new menus for every night, and opening the temporary restaurant for the public. At the end of each night, Spoerry would select a tabletop to be transformed into a snare picture. Kazanowicz also mentions, quote, dinner is a performance in its pure form, since it only lasts as long as eating takes place, and it cannot be repeated in the same shape, end quote. Kazanowicz suggests that the definition of performance is subject to a rethinking. A moment in mundane existence can be and is a performance already. But to further understand the identical lunch and snare pictures, they can only be viewed with consideration of previous artwork that blend aspects of everyday life and art, and artwork that use food as material. Within the avant-garde, cuisine has historically been important to the Italian futurist movement of the early 20th century, which manifested in nouvelle cuisine, meaning dishes that were crafted with unlikely, sometimes inedible ingredients, made by futurist cooks that, quote, did not cook in order to fill the stomach, but to satisfy the cravings of mind, end quote. To eat futuristically meant to scrape away the old notions of what food is and can be. Futurist banquets were events crafted to fulfill the need for a total work of art, an environment in which a dinner would utterly transform into a standalone artwork. The futurist banquets are the first moment of the avant-garde taking the ordinary experiences of food preparation and consumption and elevating them into a spectacle, and ultimately initiating the mode of thought on whether ordinary experiences can be transformed into artworks or if artistic practice can blend itself with the reality of the mundane. The action of ordinary experiences transformed into art was one of many foundational practices that was part of the Fluxus movement, founded and coordinated by Lithuanian-American artist George Maciunas. The work of Fluxus artists was to break any preconceived notions of what art is and can be, popularly enacting event scores, instructions for actions that a performer or many carry out, often in public space, essentially a script for a performance artwork performed around the globe, as well as championing the creation and distribution of highly reproducible works of art made from ordinary materials. Maciunas writes in the Fluxus Manifesto, quote, promote living art, anti-art, promote non-art reality to be fully grasped by all peoples, not only critics, dilettantes, and professionals, end quote. Using the Fluxus ideology, Knowles' The Identical Lunch breaks down the barrier between art and life very intentionally. In an interview with Saveur magazine, Knowles says about The Identical Lunch, quote, the act of making the same sandwich each, often seen as insignificant, could lead to changes in our daily perceptions once conceived as a personal performance. Ordering and eating the identical lunch allowed art to take place without calling for an audience. You could make a sandwich, sit down, eat it, and art was occurring whether or not you knew it or if anyone else was there, end quote. And it is exactly this idea of personal performance that Knowles mentions that aligns perfectly with the concept of a tactic, or an action of the weak against the strong. Michel de Certeau defines tactics in On the Oppositional Practices of Everyday Life as actions and or practices that are implemented by individuals or small groups in their daily life to resist the authority from systems of power and maintain autonomy within a society organized by socially constructed rhythms. Additionally, he suggests that destabilizing impositions of control through use of tactics can only happen within the socially constructed rhythms that daily life follows. De Certeau appropriates the term strategies as well, which are described as calculated actions of control that are enacted by powerful members or organizations within a society in order to influence ideology and enforce conformity, tactics being the force to combat implemented strategies. Tactics are the minuscule rebellions of the weak against the strong. the actions that one can take to sustain individuality within a society organized by socially constructed rhythms. Henri Lefebvre describes in Critique of Everyday Life, these socially constructed rhythms are ways in which the powerful can enforce conformity onto common citizens in daily life, taking the forms of mealtime, scheduled work weeks, and commute times. Lefebvre suggests that the work of art is not separate from the experience of daily life, demanding that the work of art not be fetishized as a product of unthinkable acts of creative genius that exist outside of these in-place constructed rhythms. Moreover, for Lefebvre, the everyday is always considered in relation to dominant power structures, which he defines as the ideological framework that a particular group which holds the majority of power in a society forms. Dominant power structures construct rhythms of existence such as scheduled work weeks and mealtimes as a way of imposing conformity unconsciously, as well as use urban design and public space to physically control the ways individuals exist in their physical environment. Knowles eats identical sandwiches, and Soirée hosts dinners with peers, and both works are rooted in a conscious experience of daily existence. When artists like Knowles and Soirée introduce the everyday into their artwork, they blur the lines between life and art, because for them, food and dining become the materials for a set of tactics for dismantling the unwelcome force of dominant power structures into private life. These works highlight the fact of repetition, that food is inextricably linked to every individual's daily life, which goes mostly unnoticed. Lefebvre mentions that the cyclic nature of life is not necessarily perfectly cyclical, saying that, quote, no genuine cycle returns exactly to its point of departure or reproduces itself exactly, end quote. Through the use of journaling the experiences of performance, Knowles, as well as their peers, highlights the notion that repetition never truly takes on identical form, which snare pictures also exemplify by exhibiting new compositions in the physical works after a dinner, a repeated occurrence that is never truly the same. The performance and reenactments of the identical lunch act as a subversion of power by way of appropriating public space for one's personal use outside the use assigned by systems of power. By paying for a meal and going about a lunch ritual normally, but consciously engaging with the process as a work of art, Knowles is exhibiting a tactic, regaining autonomy while participating in socially constructed norms through appropriation of the dining experience, a subtle but powerful method of resistance. Furthermore, by staging dinners within a gallery space, Soirée also is actively meditating on the ordinary experience of dinner time as a performance, reappropriating the use of mealtimes for art-making purposes, a purpose that does not serve the dominant productive rationality. These snare pictures are inseparable from the dining experiences that produce them, the dining being a performance in its own right and an instance of, as Knowles describes, quote, art occurring whether or not you know it or anyone else was there, end quote, but becoming a work of art through this intentionality. The performance of the identical lunch and the dining from which snare pictures stem from parallel, both functioning as performances and participation in art making that happens within in-place rhythms of life. The performance of the identical lunch is a work of art that champions the beliefs of Fluxus, Lefebvre, and Desserteau, acting as a reclamation space for artistic creation rooted within socially constructed mealtimes, more specifically for Knowles, the midday lunch hour. In the case of Soirée's snare pictures, taking the notion that eating dinner is, quote, a performance in its pure form, end quote, the form of Soirée's snare pictures becomes multimodal, the physical product trapping the moments of unplanned randomness during dining, but inextricably linked to the performance of dining which produced it. And through the context of Lefebvre and Desserteau's theories on everyday life as a potential site for tactical subversion, these two works employ tactics of appropriation of space, time, and commonplace items, repetition in everyday life's mundanity, and through the intentionality of art creation, transform the act of dining into works of art, subverting the pervasive blanket of capitalist ideals and exemplifying subtle but nevertheless powerful ways of resisting authority and maintaining autonomy. Thank you.
This is the exhibition catalog for the Metropolitan Museum of Art's controversial 1969 show, Harlem on My Mind, the Cultural Capital of Black America. At first glance, this catalog might seem like a celebration of Harlem's artistic and cultural legacy, but the exhibition it represents is a powerful example of how Black creativity has been historically erased, even in projects that claim to honor it. The Met's curators chose not to include a single artwork by a Black visual artist in the show, Instead, they filled the galleries with photojournalistic images, documentary-style wall text, and ambient sound recordings, effectively flattening the visual complexity of Harlem into sociology. The backlash was immediate and organized. Many artists like Romare Bearden and Faith Ringgold protested the museum's decisions, demanding that Black art be shown as art and not just evidence of culture. This exhibition sets the tone for my thesis, which looks at how Black artists, especially performance artists, have responded to similar institutional exclusions by creating alter egos. These alter egos aren't just characters or costumes. They are strategies, tactics of disruption, visibility, and speculative self-invention that push back against the narratives institutions try to impose. Here we see an image from the actual exhibition. Most of these documentary photographs, mostly taken by white photojournalists, turned Harlem into a sociological case study rather than a creative force. The exhibition told a story about Harlem, but it wasn't told by the artists. Their voices, their visions were left out, replaced by curatorial interpretations and public policy texts. As a result, the exhibition reinforced a harmful dynamic that Black life could be observed, documented, and narrated by others, but not self-authored. This misrepresentation mattered deeply because art, especially in institutions like the Met, are never neutral. Who gets shown and how they're shown shapes our collective imagination. When Black artistic voices are excluded, it doesn't just erase individuals, it distorts how Black creativity is remembered, historicized, and valued. This is the exact tension that my thesis responds to. Rather than wait for inclusion, the artists I study, William Popel, Adrian Piper, and Lorraine O'Grady, created alter egos to speak back. Their performances don't ask to be let in. They challenge the terms of visibility itself as they navigate or wander through spaces. Sarah Cervenak is an associate professor jointly appointed in the Women's and Gender Studies and African American and in African Diaspora Studies programs at the University of North Carolina. In her book titled Wandering, Philosophical Performances of Racial and Sexual Freedom, Cervenak explores the power of wandering or daydreaming for those for whose mobility has been under severe constraint, defining wandering as the movement through space, as a drifting through history, memory, and desire, landscapes that are unbound and cannot be surveilled. In response to institutional misrepresentation, like what we saw in Harlem on My Mind, many Black artists have refused to present a stable, digestible version of themselves. Instead, they engage in acts of fugitivity. Apologies. Fugitivity in this context is not just escape. It's a refusal to be fixed in place. It's a practice of moving through systems without being fully observed by them. It's a method of survival that is also speculative, imaginative, and insurgent. It asks, what does it mean to be visible but not available, to be present but not easily consumed? A key framework that grounds my thinking is this concept of wandering. Wandering here is not about aimlessness. It's purposeful, it's unpredictable, and it's a way of navigating identity, history, and an embodiment without being legible to the dominant gaze. Wandering resists capture, and it creates space for experimentation, speculation, and transformation. I position the Black alter ego as a fugitive wandering figure. These personas do not conform to institutional expectations of Blackness or respectability. They aren't interested in assimilation or correction. Instead, they expose the limits of dominant frameworks and open up other ways of being seen, or not being seen at all. I argue that the alter ego, as employed by artists like William Popel, Adrian Piper, and Lorraine O'Grady, function as a site of speculative futurity and resistance, a critical strategy that challenges institutional erasure and reclaims agency through refusal, performance, and imaginative wandering. The first artist that I want to focus on is William Popel, whose alter egos often confront power through absurdity, discomfort, and direct confrontation. In his first performance of Eating the Wall Street Journal, he appears in a business suit, seated on the sidewalk, literally eating pages from the journal, sometimes with milk or ketchup, sitting upon an American flag. The performance evolves to something grotesque, visceral, and absurd, but also deeply calculated. The American flag becomes more than a prop. It's a site of tension, one the alter ego inhabits to question belonging, power, and visibility. Draped in this emblem of national identity while consuming the financial elite's paper of record, Pulp L's alter ego enacts a kind of wandering, not through physical space, but through the symbolic terrain of American ideals and exclusions. His performance resists fixed meaning, instead moving across registers of irony, survival, and critique. Pulp L's persona here is an inversion of power. He performs a figure who is both fully visible and completely out of place, too close to the symbols of capital to be ignored, but also too disruptive to be welcomed. This contradiction is intentional, and it's where fugitivity comes into play. Here in a chaotic and suffocating environment centered around a toilet sitting upon a makeshift tower with ketchup bottles, milk cartons, a fishing pole, and crumpled pages of the Wall Street Journal, Pulp L's alter ego is not merely himself, but an exaggerated figure who disrupts normative expectations of both performance and critique. His costume, gestures, and the grotesque act of eating printed financial ephemera embodies both complicity and defiance, ingesting the mechanisms of capitalism while simultaneously breaking them down. The alter ego, in this case, functions as a means of subversion, where self-creation and distortion become tools for survival against systems that seek to erase or consume Black identity. It asks, what are we consuming when we consume culture, finance, or identity? And more importantly, who gets consumed in the process? Furthermore, eating the Wall Street Journal engages with the concept of material and symbolic consumption, themes that resonate with the ways Black artists have historically navigated institutional erasures. By turning a financial paper typically associated with white wealth and corporate stability into an unstable, bodily, and even wasteful act, Pulp L destabilizes its authority. His use of the body as a site of resistance parallels ways in which alter egos function as interventions into dominant narratives. Like the alter ego, this performance is an act of strategic disruption, forcing a re-examination of power, consumption, and visibility. For 5 days, Pulp L's bodily engagement in this performance stages a critical refusal to be passively shaped by economic and racial hierarchies, and instead transforming the body itself into a site of radical critique and endurance. If wandering is a way of moving that resists capture, this performance does just that. It's performative refusal, the act of ingesting something toxic, but on your own terms. The alter ego here is not heroic or glamorous. It's a failed citizen, a trickster, a destabilizer of meaning. Through this work, Pulp L uses the alter ego to reject coherent identity and instead embody a kind of speculative presence, one that wanders through performance but never arrives at respectability. Adrian Piper's artistic journey began in the early 1970s, being marked by a significant series, The Mythic Being. Catalyst, which is a subsequent exploration from Piper creating this alter ego, explores identity, societal norms, and the boundaries of public behavior and social standings. In the early 1970s, Piper inserted something unusual into New York's The Village Voice. Not traditional advertisements, but conceptual interventions. These ads, small and easily overlooked among classifieds, featured stark text that disrupted the everyday rhythm of the paper. With lines like, pretend not to know what you know, or end of cycle, Piper used the language and format of public announcements to challenge visibility and public awareness. Piper constructed this male alter ego, a racially ambiguous mustache figure who recited her own diary entries aloud in public while walking the streets. She wore an afro wig, sunglasses, and clothing a man of the time would wear. This character wasn't meant to blend in. He was meant to disrupt the assumed categories of gender, race, and class in everyday space. As Mythic Being appeared in various public performances and photo-based studies, this next image shows Adrian Piper during one of her performances, a series of interventions where she inserted herself into public spaces in ways that were deliberately disruptive, disorienting, and often uncomfortable for those around her. Here she wears clothes soaked in vinegar, a towel stuffed in her mouth, inhibiting her voice from reaching those near her, and enters a crowded New York City bus. It simply sits there, silent, present, leaking. The passengers shift away from her, confused and disturbed by her presence, her smell, and that's the point. The Mythic Being explores contradictions of visibility. Piper uses her body and the alter ego to become hyper-visible, but never comfortably legible. She is seen but not understood, And this is fugitivity in action, not hiding but refusing to offer a clear narrative to the institutional or public gaze. If Popel's alter ego performs refusal through absurdity, Piper's strategy is more intimate, more psychological. She puts pressure on social expectations and forces the viewer or passerby to confront their own discomforts. In doing so, she exposes how race and gender are always being read and misread in public space. Piper's alter ego wanders not to disappear, but to move through the categories that try to fix her in place. Her work asks, what if the self is not stable? What if it's a performance that shifts based on context, perception, and resistance? Through the mythic being in Catalyst, Piper doesn't just use the alter ego to evade capture. She uses it to confront, to unravel, and to reclaim the meaning of presence itself. The final figure in my research is Lorraine O'Grady, who developed one of the most confrontational, theatrical alter egos in contemporary art. O'Grady is a pioneering artist and critic whose work challenged racial and gender-based exclusions in the art world through performance, photography, and text-based interventions. Emerging in the late 1970s and early 1980s, O'Grady became a key figure in conceptual performance art, using her practice to confront institutional racism and sexism. One of her most significant enduring performances, Mademoiselle Bourgeois Noir, introduces the radical alter ego to disrupt art spaces and critique their exclusionary practices. A pageantry contestant dressed in a white gown sewn from 180 pairs of white gloves, a costume made of secondhand respectability, and carrying a whip made of white flowers, O'Grady entered art galleries uninvited and unannounced. In her first appearance in 1980 at Just Above Midtown, she shouted a poem that directly criticized both the white art establishment and the limitations of the Black avant-garde. That's enough. No more bootlicking, no more ass-kicking, no more buttering up, no more posturing of super assimilates. Black art must take more risk. Her message was clear. Exclusion is not just about being left out. It's about being invited only under certain conditions, usually silence, politeness, and conformity. Mademoiselle Bourgeois Noir was not having it. This performance is a critical infiltration, a trespass into institutional space, not to assimilate, but to unsettle. O'Grady's alter ego doesn't seek to be palatable or professional. She uses performance as protest, turning herself into a site of visible resistance within elite cultural structures. Unlike Popel's absurdist sabotager, Piper's psychological estrangement, O'Grady's alter ego is direct, sharp, and spectacular. She weaponized elegance, taking the visual codes of high society and turning them into critique. The white gloves, once a symbol of class decorum, became armor. The whip of the flowers delivered not affection, but rupture. Importantly, Mademoiselle Bourgeois Noir is not just adjusting white institutions. She also critiques how Black artists are sometimes expected to perform a certain kind of acceptable identity, even within so-called progressive spaces, and her alter ego refuses that. This, too, is a form of wandering, not in physical distance, but in ideological disruption. She moves through spaces of cultural power on her own terms, drawing attention to the gaps between who is seen and who is heard. O'Grady's work reminds us that fugitivity isn't always about leaving. Sometimes it's about showing up uninvited and demanding to be reckoned with. All three artists use the alter ego to refuse something, whether it's institutional assimilation, stable identity, or the expectations placed on Black visibility. Each alter ego opens up space for speculation, for imagining identity as fluid, multiple, and resistant to containment. There's no final version of Popel's absurd citizen, Piper's mythic figure, or O'Grady's pageant queen protester. The personas shift, contradict, and evolve, just like the histories and features they're responding to. The alter ego is not just a mask or a character. It's a tactic, an extremely potent one, a vehicle, a gesture towards freedom that refuses to be fixed. It exists in between the seen and the hidden, the real and the performed, the historical and the speculative. A moving figure never fully captured, constantly asking, what else could I be? Pope L, Piper, and O'Grady do not use alter egos to become someone else. They use them to fracture the gaze, to play with expectation, to insist on freedom, even if it means wandering into discomfort. I end with the belief that the Black alter ego is not simply a mirror to identity. It's a strategy for living otherwise, a refusal that becomes reinvention. A future once forecasted to live in the shadows of abandonment, but now defiant and radiant in its reimagination. Thank you.
Contemporary artists working today live within a world full of unseen, complex digital networks which have become intertwined with their daily existence. In cyberspace, individuals exist only as data to be commodified and fed back into the market as they are no longer able to opt out of surveillance technologies. The line between representational illusion and reality continues to blur as humans forget a world free from constant surveillance, a world separated from its dependence on technology. Through the exploration of surveillance technology as a medium for cultural intervention, contemporary artists Dr. Heather Dewey Hagborg, Jill Majid, and Hito Style perform artistic experiments to expose not only the widespread implementation of surveillance in the 21st century, but also the inherent human biases that can never be eliminated from the technology. The increasing lack of differentiation between biological organism and informational circuits is what N. Catherine Hales defines as posthumanism, a state suggesting that the intermeshing of human beings and immaterial data circuits results in the inability to distinguish one from the other. As society shifts towards becoming increasingly immaterial, biases can easily go undetected because they're entirely digital and unseen. Surveillance is characterized by any act of close observation between individuals and is culturally regarded as the act of watching in anticipation of any kind of occurrence, particularly occurrences which are visually pleasing or those which could be indicative of criminality. Today, there's no shortage of surveillance cameras in almost every institution, every business, every school, and even in many homes. Walter Benjamin ends A Short History of Photography by predicting the potential surveillance nature of photography as cameras become smaller and more optimized to capture what he describes as transitory and secret pictures which contain a tiny spark of chance. In the 21st century landscape, anyone can expect their entire existence to be monitored and recorded by multiple surveillance apparatuses catching these types of images. French philosopher Michel Foucault's 1977 theory of a panoptic society describes a society penetrated through and through with disciplinary mechanisms, emphasizing that it does not matter who exercises power because they remain unseen. This idea is actualized through Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, an apparatus designed as the optimized form of discipline in which those being surveilled are subconsciously forced to regulate their behavior. In contrast, Dr. Thomas Mathiassen's prediction of a mutual viewer society describes one where the active reciprocation of surveillance results in what he labels as the synopticon, the further evolved state of Bentham's panopticon that acknowledges the participation which individuals have become unwillingly subjected to. He argues that Foucault critically left out the influence of mass media, which has significantly impacted the way people self-regulate their behavior throughout the past century. Jonathan Finn synthesizes both ideas to emphasize that the mutual synoptic surveillance is not passive like Mathiassen and Foucault describe, but instead something that individuals have considerable agency over. Today, individuals find themselves in a state of constant self-regulation to appease those surveilling them. French theorist Guy Debord asserts his own gestures are no longer his, but those of another who represent them to him. Both he and Pierre Bourdieu describe how autonomous image production endorses the constructive narrative of disciplinary power systems. The autonomous production of surveillance images can be attributed to Bourdieu's idea of the culturally accepted belief in the value of the work. Surveillance technology reaffirms this commonly shared belief where representational illusion is portrayed as factual. Dr. Heather Dewey Hagborg's installation, Stranger Visions, from 2012 to 2013, situates itself somewhere between art, technology, and science to explore the culturally accepted empirical belief in surveillance. A blank, sterile room awaited viewers with mask-like, emotionless faces staring out above them. Various objects containing remnants of human DNA, such as food waste and cigarette butts, were collected from public spaces and then used to synthesize 3D printed portraits by inputting the samples into an algorithm that Dewey Hagborg had created. This data was collected without the knowledge or consent of the individuals it came from, stirring up unanswered ethical complications regarding unauthorized biometric data collection. In addition, this removes the audience's awareness of any differences and inconsistencies that would separate these 3D printed representations from their living, breathing counterparts. Dewey Hagborg's method of visual presentation subconsciously adds credibility to her synthesized portraits, as she relies on the audience's shared belief in the scientific credibility of surveillance technology. Lee Laura Mickelson questions biometric surveillance technologies and argues that this kind of image does not, in fact, portray humans. Rather, it portrays ways of algorithmically thinking about humans. She continues further to explain how contemporary biometric technologies echo physiognomic and highly racist pseudosciences from the 17th and 18th centuries. Mickelson notes that the existence of multiple different forensic DNA phenotyping software already undermines the validity of DNA portraits altogether. The widespread cultural acceptance of DNA portraits as empirical representations of reality endorses the fictional need for synthesized biometric data as a reliable and necessary forensic tool for law enforcement in their endless quest for conviction. Ultimately, Dewey Hagborg's portraits do not fully account for common aspects of difference, including age, chance, and disability. They are also never able to fully disconnect Dewey Hagborg's influence behind writing the algorithm from the final resulting portraits. Her installation reveals how technological advancements have made it increasingly difficult to differentiate between reality and illusion, just as Debord predicted. Only after thorough analysis with ample information are viewers able to grasp the illusion of Dewey Hagborg's algorithm as a fabricated representation of reality. Kelly Gates coins the term computational objectivity to describe society's blind trust in technology, which she explains is a renewal of the suspect promise that the biased and imperfect perceptual capacities of human beings can be eliminated or designed out of computational forms of image analysis. The biases embedded in human-created technology highlight the subjectivity ingrained in surveillance technology, debunking the idea that computational objectivity could ever be fully achieved. How could it truly be known which DNA phenotyping software is the most accurate and whether any are capable of completely reflecting reality? Jill Majid also plays into the subjectivity ingrained in surveillance technology through a series of correspondences and love letters between herself and CityWatch, the CCTV surveillance system in Liverpool. In her 2004 collection of performances known as Evidence Locker, Majid chooses to become an active subject in her own surveillance by spending 31 days allowing herself to be controlled by those working at CityWatch. She maintains intimacy with them through her constant letters, which only become more personal over the course of her project. At the time, laws in the United Kingdom gave civilians the ability to contact CityWatch for access to their own surveillance-captured images from around the city. Rather than being routinely thrown away 31 days after capture as usual, this requested footage was then sent out to the subject of surveillance upon request and stored for 7 years in what is known as an evidence locker. Instead of concealing herself from surveillance, Majid provided CityWatch with additional information about herself through her letters with them, information that could never have been concretely gathered from the footage of her alone. In one of her letters, she states, "I will record the inside for you. I will mark the time carefully so you will never lose me. Don't worry about finding me. I will help you." Feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey relates the act of surveillance to Sigmund Freud's analysis of scopophilia, which is the aesthetic and sometimes sexual pleasure derived from the act of looking or the act of being looked at that relies upon an open observation of others, a mutual awareness of surveillance. When giving herself up to be controlled, Majid describes positive feelings from being watched and from giving up confidential information about herself. Majid uses scopophilia to her advantage by actively flirting with her observers at CityWatch, encouraging and eventually reciprocating their behavior. By day 24, Majid begins to question if her observer could be anyone walking past her on the street, or even herself somehow. Over time, Majid only becomes more intertwined with CityWatch and her observers, which results in her desire to switch roles with them, ultimately aspiring to participate in surveillance, as she mentions wanting to watch her observer in return to them watching her. On day 24, she states, "Sometimes people would bump into me or brush against me and I would flinch. You'd go, 'Oh, sorry. Oh, excuse me.' Were you me or the person who bumped into me? Fellow performance artist Elise Morrison describes Majid's personal intervention with surveillance as a media of two-way communication rather than one-way discipline, as well as a critique of surveillance technology's inability to capture the intricate record of a person. Over the course of her performances, Majid starts to self-regulate her behavior on behalf of those surveilling her, seeing herself through their biases and giving up vital information about not just herself, but also her whereabouts. Majid's participation and agency through her interaction with CCTV surveillance cameras reveals how deeply ingrained and completely invisible human biases become within surveillance technology. Whereas Majid orchestrates when she is seen by surveillance technology and eagerly gives up information about herself, Style reconciles with modern-day perpetual visibility granted from surveillance technologies, as they've historically been used as tools for violence. In her 15-minute video, How Not to Be Seen, a fucking didactic educational.mov file, Style separates the satirical instructional manual into 5 lessons on how to become invisible from surveillance cameras. First, she demonstrates 4 ways to avoid being seen using simple tactics, such as painting her face green to match the green screen. Second, for her second lesson, Style describes 7 ways to become invisible in plain sight, including painting her face green to match a green screen. As the video progresses slowly through her subtly targeted demonstrations, some of the words she lists here, such as scroll, wipe, shrink, and erase, feel pulled directly from the artist's interaction with her own digitized image in cyberspace. By the third lesson, the film's narrative starts to devolve into multiple paths through Style's discovery that she is no longer able to avoid surveillance. As an act of resistance, she continues by teaching the audience 7 ways to become invisible by becoming a picture, suggesting that the internality of a subject is lost once it is turned into an image. Style notes the recent exponential advancement of surveillance technology, stating that satellite photographic image resolution has had a roughly 3,600% increase in visibility over the last 20 years. She imagines a world where people have become pixels, as the screen quickly fills with multiple figures who have cube-shaped heads. Using a green screen, they jump and spin around frantically in front of surveillance practice targets. As they dance around the screen, the cube-shaped individuals are seen acting with autonomy despite their transformation into pixels, which has already occurred. The fourth lesson in Style's video sheds light on some of the many socioeconomic biases that are played out through surveillance technologies, as she teaches the audience how to become invisible by disappearing in 13 different ways. Some of the reasons listed here include satirical jabs, such as being a female and over 50, being spanked by a filter, and owning an anti-paparazzi handbag. However, other ways of becoming invisible that she lists carry more serious implications, such as being undocumented or poor, living in a military zone, and being a disappeared person as an enemy of the state. Style leaves the audience with the frightening question, are people hidden by images, or indeed do they become images? Under constant surveillance, Style sees how she has become unwillingly subjected to infinite biases through the incessant, unauthorized capturing of her own image. Rather than accepting her fate of being surveilled constantly, Style challenges the use of surveillance by systems of power to reveal the cultural influence that visibility, or lack thereof, now holds. An automated voice in Style's video points out that there are currently over 170,000 disappeared people per year, despite our current age of perpetual visibility. There is violence inherent with becoming invisible and losing complete control over one's own image. Style's video functions less as instructions on how to become invisible for those who are already visible, but rather as vital information to the audience on why surveillance technologies were created, how they function, who they target, and what the future possibilities are for artists in a world full of perpetual visibility. Much like the target she stands in front of, Style represents individuals at the receiving end of violence at the hands of surveillance technology. In an effort to combat this, Style chooses to reject dematerialization and commodification through her various creative methods of going undetected by surveillance cameras. As Hales explained, humans and the immaterial data circuits in which humans are now intertwined with can no longer be separated from one another, resulting in the post-human, an organic being that is reliant on technological apparatuses in order to function. There is no possible escape from existing in cyberspace in the 21st century. Dewey Hagborg, Majid, and Style all co-opt traditional uses for surveillance, which exposes the human biases that are ingrained in surveillance technology. Dewey Hagborg uncovers the potential of individuals to observe one another through unseen immaterial data circuits which make up daily modern life. Majid flirts with her observers, using surveillance technology, seemingly more than welcome to their control over her actions. She is never able to stop seeing herself through their gaze, however, to the point where it completely changes and regulates her behavior. Despite Stahl's efforts to avoid being seen, she is no longer able to separate herself from the daily existence, the same surveillance tools that are created to enact military violence. This reveals the fundamental purpose of surveillance, which is control. The experiments of these three artists demonstrate how today's unavoidable, inherently biased surveillance apparatuses trigger the self-regulation of individuals in an effort to maintain socio-political control within cyberspace and within real life. Thank you.
In this writing, I present the idea that magic performance, also known as sleight of hand or leisurely bond magic, can be framed as a mode of performance art. Also, that performance art is constituted by audience participation. For my case studies, I chose the performances of Chris Burden, Yoko Ono, Ryan Lawrence, and David Copperfield. For my argument, I used the Marxist idea of the base superstructure model. According to Marx, a society's base refers to its economic infrastructure, including the labor and technology that contribute to its production. Superstructure refers to the non-economic facets of a society. For example, institutions, law, culture, and arguably the most important, ideology. To clarify, I identify a social product of capitalism as discontent among the general public. This frustration is primarily released in two avenues, confrontation and escapism. But what makes performance art is audience participation. Performance art has no clear starting point, but Rosalie Goldberg argues that it begins with the futurist movement in the early 20th century. For Goldberg, performance art has a unique quality of utilizing an artist's body as art material, which was a new and appealing concept to an increasingly capitalist art market that favored physical items that could be bought and sold. Like Goldberg, Moira Roth noticed the political nature of performance art of this time. Roth also noticed the potential space that performance art had for women. Performance art allowed women to express feminist ideas and frustrations with a patriarchal society. One such artist being Yoko Ono, whose work Cut Piece expressed this very idea. Klaus Biesenbach, Christoph Schuri, and Yoko Ono revitalized this work for contemporary audiences at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2015. Another popular example of performance art during this time is Chris Burden's Shoot, which is recounted by Jan Tumleer and Fraser Ward. Tumleer concerns himself with how performance changed the trajectory of Burden's career as an artist. Ward, on the other hand, is the one to question the role of audience in Burden's performance, calling it an exchange of violence and passivity. Fraser Ward expands on the audience's role in performance art, claiming that it has no innocent bystanders, meaning that audience passivity does not exclude one from responsibility for the outcome in performance art. Like other examples of performance art, magic has a similar need for audience participation. This is shown by Brian Rappert, who took it upon himself to learn magic tricks and perform them to multiple groups of audiences. Through these regular interactions, Rappert made discoveries about the audience's varying behaviors in different circumstances. One of the most important discoveries being that the audience and performer adapt to each other in magic to avoid awkwardness. This follows the idea of Peter Lamont, who believed that entertainment magic's appeal was its ability to delight an audience with illusions, even if the audience knows such illusions are taking place, which is often the case. While establishing audience participation as the criteria for performance art, I intend to identify how magic fits under the performance art umbrella. I also intend to understand the lack of women in the world of magic performance. Finally, I intend to look into what social agreements take place. Performance art is a response to the world. Art as activism in the 1970s and 80s was over a backdrop of growing civil rights movements across the United States. During this time of civil rights activism for the Black community, there was also the gay rights movement ignited from the Stonewall riot in 1969. It is also relevant to mention the rise of second-wave feminism during this time. The point being that performance art of this time was fueled from a context of restlessness, discontent, and activism in the real world. These systemic issues within the society were supported and perpetuated by capitalism that profited off the endless production of violence. Art is a different avenue. One that did not require marching on streets, but still confronted the status quo all the same. As I state in my paper, quote, "What connects magic and conceptual performance is the use of the audience. More specifically, how audience participation is an essential component of performances of this kind," unquote. According to Fraser Ward, performance is validated by audience participation, and every member implicated as an accomplice to the act. Audience interaction can take place in multiple ways. An example of performance art I used to describe this point is Chris Burden's Shoot, which took place in November of 1971. The written description of the performance reads, quote, "At 7:45 p.m., I was shot in the left arm by a friend. The bullet was a Copper Jacket .22 long rifle. My friend was standing about 15 feet from me," unquote. The friend in this situation is Bruce Dunlap, a friend of Burden's. Dunlap was handpicked for this act by Burden himself, as was the rest of the audience present at the performance that night. This choice to include personal relationships in the performance complicates the assumption of responsibility upon the performer for the performance's outcome. I state in my paper, quote, "The goal of confrontational performance like Burden's Shoot, for his audience to be inflicted with the anxiety of accountability for one's actions and presence in the performance, and therefore is forced to consider the performance relationship to the material world," unquote. Shoot was a response to Burden's personal frustrations with gun violence against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Burden's performance interacts with his audience through a demonstration of radical empathy. Burden did not initially intend for the shot to actually hit. He intended for the bullet to merely graze him. The precariousness of Burden's position and the position of others implicates them in this act of violence. What if Burden had died from the shot? Who would be responsible? These are questions Burden is asking the audience to consider in the confines of the art gallery and beyond. Similarly, Yoko Ono confronted her audience in her performance Cut Piece. In this performance, Ono allows an audience of strangers to cut away at her nice clothing. However, what makes this act a confrontation is Ono's perceived deference. I describe it as, quote, "In this action, Ono is willingly surrendering herself to her audience to show a vulnerability previously only known to women by way of oppression. More specifically, the act of cutting off a woman's clothes can be associated in this performance with themes of sexual violence or a general lack of bodily autonomy, which disproportionately affects women," unquote. I say perceived deference because in reality, Ono was free to end the performance and her violation whenever she pleased. In feigning deference, Ono bestows the audience with a sense of agency and allows them to believe they are not in fact acting as the artist intends. While confrontational performance art was a method of releasing frustrations with the real world, magic performance serves a different purpose. Still utilizing the participation of an audience, magic performance channels positive, feel-good energy, allowing an escape from the hard realities of life under capitalism. Instead of spending invaluable assets, such as time and money, for access to a confrontation, audiences who seek magic performance are looking to forget frustrations in their lives. Magic performance is a fun alternative to confronting systemic issues. It acts as an alternative that is easier to digest than the evident suffering and melancholy displayed in artistic confrontations. One local magician, Ryan Lawrence, currently works as a resident magician at the Chicago Magic Lounge. It is Lawrence who argues that participation in magic often results in a change of persona, both for his audience members and himself. Lawrence claims that audiences will change the way they usually act and dress when coming to a performance. This is because magic performances at the Magic Lounge are often seen as special events. Events such as these are often partnered with celebration. For Lawrence as a performer, he changes his behavior for the audience. He claims to use humor in order to distract from the mistakes or elevate a moment on stage. He also believes that the magician has a role on host on top of performing. Lawrence describes the role as, quote, "The magician was really the master of ceremonies. They were the person that was the invited guest to the party that would pull a chair out, make sure audience members were comfortable and sitting down, and being able to politely poke fun at people and suspend their disbelief without insulting them is really important," unquote. According to Brian Rappert, quote, "Cancellations of logical trains of thought obfuscate understanding and create a level of mysticism through presentations of the impossible," unquote. I consider this to be a mystical social contract, as it is an agreement between performer and audience in a performance setting. It allows audiences to suspend their beliefs, even if otherwise a skeptic, to allow both parties enjoyment. Unlike confrontational performance, critical thinking and logic is not exactly encouraged. Like Rappert, Graham M. Jones notes how other magicians use exclusivity in the form of secrets to raise the status of a performer. By having rare knowledge of the workings of illusions, magicians have power over the audience. The system of sharing secrets also acts as a form of checks and balances in the magician community, making sure that secrets stay in the right hands. Such a system applies to Ryan Lawrence, who believe that despite the exclusivity of secrets, magicians should make efforts to include and invite their audiences. Lawrence does this by having volunteers participate in his tricks and adding hospitality to his magic practice. David Copperfield is one of the most famous magicians in the world today. However, Copperfield seems to abuse his power as a magic performer. Journalist Jess Bravin recalls David Copperfield's television show, The Magic of David Copperfield, with more similarities to a rock concert than a magic performance. The introduction to every episode was often followed with electric guitar riffs, flashing lights, and sometimes pyrotechnics. Bravin also notes Copperfield's inappropriate interactions with his young female audience. Copperfield would often ask young girls to, quote, "spread their legs," or place them in inappropriate situations. For example, tugging on a pair of scissors Copperfield held firmly to his pants, while the audience laughed at the assistant's expense. This shows how a performer can violate their audience by using status to get away with inappropriate actions. This is even further vindicated by Kara Tabachnik and Alison Galtieri, who reported on David Copperfield's personal relationship with convicted sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. According to my research, there is little scholarship on magic performance for many reasons. There are secrets to protect, and art historians do not consider it often in an academic context. However, there is even less scholarship on women magicians. Where confrontational performance had many outspoken feminists, perhaps Copperfield's legacy deters women from practicing, or perhaps there has simply been no precedent for women in magic outside of the role as assistant. One of Copperfield's famous lines from The Magic of David Copperfield was that there were no camera tricks. It is easy to assume that any illusions on screen are camera work. This betrays the part of magic's appeal that no logical explanation existed to fall back on. It takes away the ability to be truly deluded. By putting magic through a screen, it creates not one audience, but two, both with varying success. Copperfield had both an in-person and television audience, which expands ticket sales and notoriety, but the magic falls flat. As a personal experiment, I participated in The Magic of David Copperfield 8, Mystery on the Orient Express, which could be done as long as one had a recording of the performance. It was less than enchanting to participate in a trick through a YouTube video, where a version of David Copperfield that no longer existed claimed to read my mind in real time through a television. Unlike in-person magic performance with a live audience, television tricks are less successful and they do not stand the test of time. According to Marx, based on the base superstructure model, the economic system of a society has influence over social norms. Performance art, therefore, is a response to a capitalist system that enables and perpetuates violence and exploitation. Confrontation and escapism are two examples of ways performance art responds to this reality. One can choose to confront the madness, or pretend it is simply not happening for a fraction of time. However, what really determines performance art is the audience's participation. Whether active or compliant, performer and audience relationships are essential to the art of performance because only then can conversation take place. Thank you.
In this presentation, I explore how German artist Anne Imhof, through her works Angst 2, Faust, and Sex, questions the taboo nature of death and how Imhof uses techniques of hybridity to evoke an experience of the uncanny for her audience. My analysis focuses on these three performances of hers through the theory of psychoanalysis, particularly Sigmund Freud's concept of the uncanny, and keeping in mind performance studies. I explore how through Imhof's use of durational performance, indistinct materials, aesthetic choices, and psychologically charged spaces, audience members are made to confront the unsettling and challenged to reconsider their perceptions of mortality. Quickly, I would like to discuss performance art. Performance art is one of the most immersive forms of art. At its base, performance art is responsible for transforming artistic creativity and change through performing, which in Imhof's performances changes the audience members' perspectives on mortality through components of her performance. Author Xitlay Barajas helps define performance art as, quote, blurs the line between art and life by including everyday actions such as brushing one's teeth, chopping vegetables, or watching television as possible metaphors to express, for example, boredom or ennui, unquote. Performance challenges societal norms and calls into question what we consider to be art and changes how we interact with art. Christine Stiles writes in the book Critical Terms for Art History, quote, performance, unlike conventional art, asserts embodiment and interconnection in time, space, and place as the basis of human experience, perception, and representation, unquote. Performance art separates itself from regular paintings, sculptures, and architecture by the direct involvement that is required by the audience. Performance art is a non-passive interaction, and Andrea Miku supports this by writing, quote, performance art happens in real time as a process of interaction between performers and participants, unquote. Anne Imhof grew up in Frankfurt, Germany during the 1980s. She combined multiple artistic mediums, including painting, sound, fashion, and choreography. Her early experiences working as a nightclub bouncer in the red light district, along with formal training at the Frankfurt School of Art, helped shape her hybrid artistic language. At a strip club in the red light district, Imhof held her first performance. For this work, she had recruited 2 boxers in a band to perform. The boxers were ordered to fight for as long as the music played, and the band was ordered to play for as long as the boxers fought. It was a grueling yet provocative piece. Imhof says, quote, it was all pretty red. The table dance bar and the noses. Looking back on it, I realized it had been one way to create a picture, unquote. Although the duration of this performance is unknown, it is here that we see Imhof showcase an interest in durational performances. Imhof's performances are immersive, durational, and often physically and emotionally taxing for performers and audiences alike. Hybridity is central to how Imhof stages these psychological effects. She raises questions about immortality and the uncanny of death. She departs from some expectations of performance art and is unlike early performance art, where an artist would typically participate in the performance themselves. Imhof instead chooses to choreograph her performances. Susan Blawhurst defines hybridity as, quote, I consider that hybridity in performance is definable as variously the blurring and combining of traditional theater, dance, music, art, and everyday life into single works. The trading of differences between high and low cultural registers, the merging together of seemingly inconsistent notions of time, space, and identity, and the de-estabilization of audience identification and affective standpoints, unquote. In all 3 performances, fashion plays a critical role. The performers often wear black and edgy clothes, sometimes even high-end streetwear like Balenciaga. These garments are responsible for blurring distinctions between art, fashion, and goth subculture, which reflect mourning and death. Performance theorist Anthony Howell emphasizes clothing and the role it plays by saying, quote, performance artists do not see themselves as actors. They do not necessarily take on roles different to their own. They are still projecting a self or a persona through posture, through body language, and through their clothing, unquote. Briefly, it is also important to mention how endurance plays a crucial role in Imhof performances, not just as a process, but as a psychological challenge to us. The extended duration transcends passive viewing into constant encounter with discomfort and uncertainty. Psychoanalyst Stephen Frosch argues that endurance is an ethical practice. It is a way to remain present when discomfort arises. Quote, psychoanalysis reminds us that there is something important about stillness, about remaining with the situation until it organizes itself under the pressure of its own desire. It reminds us, that is to say, of the virtues of endurance, unquote. Endurance is not just about time, but it's about vulnerability, about being exposed to slow, uncertain situations that unfold in front of us without a clear resolution. Frosch states, quote, staying still, not immediately agreeing or disagreeing, not acting in or acting out, learning to be full of revere of oneself. These are difficult tasks for any of us when faced with the possibility that what we might encounter might be embarrassment or pain, unquote. The active enduring hours of performance forces audience members to interact where they are no longer just observing. They are now pulled into a psychological and emotional performance that slowly unfolds and disorganizes the audience. The concept of the uncanny provides a critical framework to analyze Anne Imhof performances. The uncanny refers to something that is both familiar and strange, or the return of the repressed. and it produces feelings of discomfort or dread. Freud states, quote, that the uncanny would always be that in which one does not know where one is, as it were, unquote. The uncanny is threatening, and it's responsible for turning our recognition of everyday objects against us. The term uncanny derives from the German term unheimlich, which translates to the unhomely, suggesting that something lacks intimacy or familiarity. The objects and components, like the industrial materials, glass panels, spatial layers, drones, fog, and the often motionless bodies, are all very familiar materials to us, but Imhof makes them strange, lending her performances to a critical analysis through Freud's concept of the uncanny. Imhof is also a painter, and in her painting of Clown, also known as Wisteria, we see a strong presence of the uncanny. The inscribed and violet marks on her painting leave an impact that can be described as no less than disturbing. The figure of the clown alone emits an eerie and uncanny feeling, but by adding the explicit text and intense inscriptions on the aluminum, the idea of horror and death presents itself as a dominating force. One that cannot be ignored, leaving us uncomfortable and disturbed. The choice of aluminum is also a key aspect here. By allowing spectators to see their own reflections through choice of aluminum, the aluminum transforms the painting into a mirror as well. And when Freud wrote on the uncanny, he explored the idea of this mirror functioning as a double as prescribed by Otto Rank. The double is explained by Freud writing, quote, for the double was originally an assurance against destruction to the ego, an energetic denial of the power of death, unquote. The double served as the core of human life. It encompasses issues of identity, narcissism, and the fear of death. This double functioned as a symbol of protection, a guard to one's mortality, but over time this double becomes a symbol of death itself. Quote, having been an assurance of immortality, he becomes the ghastly harbinger of death, unquote. The doubling is evoked in Imhof performances through mirrors, glass panels that separate the audience and the audience's ability to observe while also being watched by the performers. This double is activated by the conflict between presence and absence, as well as our estrangement. Angst 2 takes place at the Hamburger Bahnhof, a museum in Berlin that often holds performance acts. This performance ran for 2 weeks, and no visitor could experience the same performance as the previous night, but each performance carried the same aesthetic components. The fog, the tyrant that was hung above audience members, the falcon that was perched on the arm of a skinny, long-haired health goth, cigarettes, drones, and opera-like sounds that radiate out the hall. The combination of these elements creates a dense, atmospheric experience. These elements are individually familiar. Fog, for instance, evokes an atmosphere similar to nightclubs or eerie environments, but in Imhof's context, they are used to produce confusion and dread. Lori Roja, who reviewed the performance of Angst 2, says, quote, a sense of dread and curiosity came over the audience, and when the drone started lifting in synchrony, they hovered about the hall in different directions with no clear purpose, unquote. This feeling evoked by the drones, juxtaposed with the fog, the performer's erratic motions, and the operatic music that also rang in the performer's ears, support how these objects have been turned against us and support the uncanny of Imhof's performances. The fog in this performance carries most of the weight. Imhof's use of fog evokes a deeper psychological effect on the audience. As the audience moves through this performance and tries to sense a glimpse of what is happening, the fog doesn't allow for a clear resolution of the performance. And as the performers move through the fog, appearing and disappearing as they please, their actions reinforce the uncanny. To Freud, the uncanny is caused by confusion. It is caused when these elements are ultimately used against us to create something different. Throughout this performance, the elements come together to create this uncanny reality of the end, such as death. And these elements have become so familiar to everyday life, have now been turned against us and used to mirror the spreading anxiety and fear of the unknown. In Angst 2, the uncanny emerges as a tangible force with a psychological weight that bears directly on the audience. In Faust, the concept of the uncanny re-emerges with strong force. The setting of this performance takes place in the German pavilion, a space that provides rooms and doorways that the audience must navigate through to capture the entirety of this performance. Yet the technique of hybridity brings together many objects, such as the glass panels, cells, and clothing in the performance that evoke the uncanny. This performance, unlike Angst 2, forces the audience to move through rooms where they are watched and never feel a sense of comfort, causing a non-passive interaction. David Velasco comments on how the German pavilion has been, quote, stripped to its basics. It's the kind of minimal only money can buy. Thick glass walls and an elevated glass floor, joined by stainless steel brackets, carve up the space, unquote. Faust includes metal cells, industrial materials, and 2 Doberman pinschers that roam the front metal cell outside of the German pavilion. In Faust, performers perform under the glass floor that has been elevated from the pavilion's cement floor, but also above it. As the audience moves through the different rooms of the pavilion, they come across metal enclosures that often echo the look and feel of prison cells. It's a noticeable approach to explore the uncanny. These structures place the performers in a space that feels caught between open and closed, seen and unseen. That blurred line between access and restriction makes this setting feel unsettling. And in Rank's idea of the double, it comes through clearly here. In the reflection on glass, it mirror gazes in the repetition of these metal cells, all of which are responsible for the direct correlation of Freud's theory of the uncanny. It's also worth pointing out the clothing choices and how they reflect themes tied to goth subculture, which itself taps into the taboo around death. Eliza Douglas, who appears often in Imhof's performances, plays a key role here. Douglas is Imhof's partner and an artist in her own right, and also a model for Balenciaga. When David Velasco says, quote, "I think Douglas looks as good walking for Imhof as she does for Ventmonts and Balenciaga," unquote, this is where I point to Rank's theory of the double once again. Douglas, a model and performer, brings the same traits that's used on a Balenciaga runway show into Imhof's performances. She becomes a double of herself. It shows how fashion isn't just about style, but it's a projection of identity. And in this case, the goth aesthetic goes beyond just visuals. It taps into themes of mortality and mourning. This is the connection that creates a sense of the uncanny for the audience as they watch. Ashley Watkins says the following about goth culture. Quote, "The subculture and its members create atmospheres frequently characterized as macabre, despairing, or simply dark. The atmosphere they create is intended both to be experiences by others who encounter them, but also experiences to be by the creator themselves," unquote. By merging high fashion with the gothic and the performative, Imhof doesn't just reference death. She stages it as an atmosphere that the audience must move through, confront, and feel, reinforcing the uncanny performance. In Sex, Imhof weaves hybridity into every facet of this performance, encapsulating themes of the uncanny and death. The architectural layout, multi-layered and complex, both enforces and dismantles traditional hierarchies, challenging standard notions of power. Performed in the tanks of the Tate Modern, the installation featured glass panels, platforms, speakers, and mattresses, creating an environment that was disorienting as it was immersive. This performance toured the world and has often been regarded as Imhof's greatest performance. A quote from Susan Broadhurst says, on Sex says, quote, "Audience and performers encounter each other at different spatial layers, which leaves the activities of the latter strangely oblique," unquote. This layering mirrors psychological unease, placing performers above the audience to suggest dominance and surveillance. The inaccessibility of these platforms forces the audience into uncomfortable confrontational positions, blurring the line between observer and participant. The spatial layering mirrors psychological unease. Veronica Simpson writes, quote, "We turn out to be the most fascinating and fascinated spectacle of all. We prowl around trying to spot the performers, whipping out our smartphones when we find one, jostling to get into position when we get a whiff of something about to happen, although nothing much does," unquote. The unpredictability and inherent chaos of the performance reflect Freud's concept of the uncanny. The loss of control, shared with unease and the unknown, provokes thoughts of our mortality. The audience is compelled to see the performers as a mirror of themselves, a notion Freud encapsulates by saying, quote, "But the storyteller has a peculiar directive influence over us. By means of the states of mind into which he can put us and the expectations he can rouse in us, he is able to guide the current of our emotions," unquote. Here, Imhof assumes the role of the storyteller, orchestrating an uncomfortable confrontation with our own mortality and the uncanny. In conclusion, Imhof doesn't just stage uncanny performances. She uses them to confront our estrangement from death. Her work brings mortality back into views that are rarely shown, suppressed, and often avoided. She goes beyond the usual use of sound, clothing, and materials. Instead, she takes ordinary everyday objects and turns them into tools of destruction. Objects that become so unfamiliar, it becomes disturbing. They serve as haunting reminders of the uncanny. Imhof intentionally creates discomfort for an audience living in a world that has grown numb to the weight of death. She is more than a performance artist. Imhof is an artist who uses performance to remind us of our own mortality. Her works aren't just performances. They are urgent psychological chambers, and if we don't stop to confront the reality of death, we become more at risk and blind to a truth that's been pushed aside, one that remains with us, strange and unresolved. Thank you.
Felix Gonzalez-Torres was a Cuban-American visual artist who emerged in the art world during the late 1980s to early 1990s. Born in 1957 in Guaymara, Cuba, Gonzalez-Torres immigrated and spent much of his life in New York. Gonzalez-Torres was a reserved person and reluctant to share details of his life and relationship, as Julie Alt, colleague and friend of the artist, shares in her book. He never wanted to, quote, "distract from his language as an artist," end quote, and would frequently state, quote, "I am not the work." However, when his partner Ross Laycock passed away from AIDS complications in 1991, Gonzalez-Torres began to freely share aspects of his life. He would photograph physical love letters as evidence of his relationship, attend interviews, and speak out on his fears and illness and eventual death that would take his lover, transforming these fears into works of art. Alt notes that in 1995, Gonzalez-Torres would change his personal policy to allow photographs of himself to accompany articles about his work.
Although private, Gonzalez-Torres was generous when it came to distributing his art, allowing audiences to take part physically and emotionally in his participatory works, specifically his paper stacks and candy spills. Here, viewers would reach for a piece of candy or take a sheet of paper, breaking that traditional boundary that museums uphold. Gonzalez-Torres' trust in the viewer would become a crucial factor in future interpretations of his work, as many have interpreted the work as melancholic suffering. For example, Mata Cruz, art historian and curator, analyzes the melancholic feeling in Gonzalez-Torres' artwork in her essay, introducing scholar Julia Kristeva and her definition of melancholia, a, quote, sad voluptuousness and despondent intoxication, end quote, attaching this motif to his work. In the 1917 essay, Mourning and Melancholia, Sigmund Freud defines the two typical responses to grief. He defines mourning as, quote, the reaction to the loss of a loved person, end quote, or the reaction to the loss of, quote, one's country, liberty, or ideal, end quote. Freud views mourning as a normal response to grief, which can only be healed through time, and any interference is harmful. In this mourning period, the afflicted person will experience their pain externally, finding that they have little interest in society or in finding a new object of love, ensuring a clear rejection of, quote, any activity that is not connected with thoughts of their loss, end quote. Freud believes that at the end of the mourning period, the afflicted person will resolve their grief and find acceptance, moving forward with their life. Melancholia, however, is defined as a harmful extension of mourning transformed into a pathological condition, resulting in a fixation towards loss. Melancholia shares the same symptoms as mourning, but takes it a step further and internalizes the loss without a clear recognition of it. This internalization will not allow the afflicted person to move on, as one would do in mourning, as they become fixated on the lost object, experiencing a narcissistic identification with the loss, becoming, quote, a substitute for the erotic cathesis, end quote. Cathesis means the amount of energy invested into the loss, and erotic being used as a broad term for affection or desire. At this stage, it is no longer about the loss, but about the stricken ego, which has fused and identified itself with the lost object. The refusal to part from it creates severe attachment known as melancholia. Observing the art of Gonzalez-Torres through the Freudian perspective may suggest a severe attachment of grief in his works, as the repetition of the loss of his partner is experienced in his candy spills and paper stacks, mirroring an unresolved pathological form of melancholia. However, with Gonzalez-Torres allowing the audience to participate in the depletion of the works, he avoids this, focusing on renewal and an open interpretation of mourning. This ideal was originally fleshed out and written by author Emily Boone Hagenmeyer in her essay untitled Queer Mourning in the Art of Felix Gonzalez-Torres, arguing that, quote, the art of Gonzalez-Torres does not insist upon letting go of the loss in order to overcome grief, end quote, focusing instead on a form of queer mourning that is dynamic. Gonzalez-Torres participates in queer mourning in a few ways, by publicly mourning the loss of his lover and by inviting the audience to participate in the action of taking away from his works. Hagenmeyer also uses Douglas Crimp's analysis of queer mourning as a form of activism for those who are, quote, unconsidered or excluded, end quote. She connects this to Gonzalez-Torres' artwork in Public Grief, labeling it as action and not as, quote, a debilitating stagnant process, end quote. Hagenmeyer believes that Gonzalez-Torres threatens the binary understanding of life and death, quote, challenging the dominant medical discourse that endorses giving up and letting go of the dead as the appropriate way to ease grief, end quote. Gonzalez-Torres' motif of the untitled title was an intentional move on his part, as he mentions in an interview with Robert Nakaz, saying, quote, things were suggested or alluded to discreetly. The work is untitled because meaning is always shifting in time and place, end quote. Deborah Cherry, art historian and curator, examines this decision, writing, quote, the artist created a distinctive form for the titles of his works. The reiterated untitled reprise from minimalism is accompanied by a subtitle in parentheses, end quote. She further writes that the parenthetical subtitles provide insights into, quote, decorations and dedications, places and people, invocations and addresses, end quote. Although all untitled, the influence of the parenthetical subtitle ideally aims the viewer to interpret the works in the context of Gonzalez-Torres' personal life. This motif has also become quite popularized in reference to Gonzalez-Torres, paying homage to the artist, as Hagenmeyer has done with the title of their essay. Gonzalez-Torres' most recognizable artwork is titled Untitled Portrait of Ross in L.A., created in 1991. This work consists of colorful candies individually wrapped in corresponding colorful plastic wrappers, mixed in a pile that ideally weighs 175 pounds in total. The pile is composed of a hard candy called Fruit Flashers, as acknowledged by Nancy Spector, curator and friend of the artist. The candies are mass-produced and bought by weight, having an associated flavor profile to each color. The dimensions of work vary with installation, allowing curators and the institution to decide on its display, but the most common form is in a large pile situated against a blank gallery wall. Official labels, such as the one provided by the Felix Gonzalez Torres Foundation, have no description of the artwork other than its dimensions and weight. But personal interpretation and the parenthetical subtitles provide context into the meaning behind the work. The artwork is an allegorical portrait of Ross Laycock, the artist's partner. The ideal weight of the pile, 175 pounds, indicates the weight Laycock maintained when he was healthy. As the pile diminishes, it reflects the loss of weight Laycock experienced with AIDS. The never-ending pile of candy may represent an extreme form of fixation on the artist's lover and on his death, falling into the Freudian interpretation of melancholia, a pathological fixation on loss, when Gonzalez Torres opts to include an instruction in the work that suggests otherwise. He instructs the audience to participate in the work by requesting that they take from the pile, depending on the audience to reduce the pile of candy only for it to become refilled once again. According to Tim Rollins, Gonzalez Torres commented on this request in a 1993 interview, saying, quote, "I need the viewer, I need the public interaction. Without a public, these works are nothing. I need the public to complete the work. I've asked the public to help me, to take responsibility, to take part of my work, to join in," end quote. By inviting the audience to become part of the work, allowing the endless cycle of candy to continue to flow, it reinvents the melancholic interpretation, engaging the viewer to join in the collective mourning of the person represented. Hagemeyer writes that through this gesture, quote, "The artist allows viewers to participate in a collective mourning of Ross, a mourning that transcends boundaries between individual lives and death," end quote. Untitled Lover Boys, created in 1991, consists of blue and white spiraled candy, individually wrapped in transparent plastic, weighing an ideal 355 pounds in total. Like the previous artwork, this candy pile fluctuates in dimension and form, taking shape by suggestion of the curators and institution, often displayed in a large pile situated against the gallery wall. The weight of this work, practically doubled from the previous bill, holds significant value in the interpretation alongside the parenthetical subtitle, alluding to the work being a representation of Gonzalez Torres and Laycock. In an interview with Robert Nikas, Gonzalez Torres confirmed the artwork subtitled as Lover Boys were a representation of himself of his partner, saying, quote, "The pieces called Lover Boys are piles of candies based on body weights. I use my own weight or mine and Ross's together," end quote. This work mourns the two figures represented and their relationship. Joan Gibbons expands on this, writing, quote, "Gonzalez Torres represented the relationship by means of pairings or intertwinings that represented the notion of ideal lovers," unquote. Spector backs this up, writing, quote, "In his ideal world, people do not endure alone. They survive in pairs as part of loving couples who age together," end quote. Like the earlier candy spill, Untitled Lover Boys shifts grief from becoming an individual experience, one that would isolate the artist in melancholia. The two representative figures in the work become symbols of ideal lovers swirled together, resisting complete disappearance in the renewing pile of candy. The pile changes over time, as Cherry writes, quote, "They exist in an ebb and flow between those who take and those who remake, those who regard and those who touch," end quote. While the candy spells of Gonzalez Torres intrigue a viewer through their bright colors and ability to be consumable, the paper stacks lure viewers with their neat appearance, taking up space on the museum floor like candies. Untitled Double Portrait, created in 1991, is a stack of offset prints on paper, each sheet displaying two symmetrical golden circles, positioned horizontally side by side and centered on a white background. The stack ideally measures at 10 1/4 inches in height, with each sheet measuring at 39 3/8 inches in length and 27.5 inches in width. The material, print paper, is accessible and able to be endlessly reproduced. The motif of two subjects is strongly represented here with the two rings. Although untitled, the parenthetical subtitle of Double Portrait implies the work to be a representation of two people, again perhaps representing Gonzalez Torres himself and his partner. The usage of two golden circles gently touching one another also implies an intimate connection. The symbol of the two circles becomes recognizable to the viewer, representing wedding bands, the figure 8, or the sign of eternity. As audience members reach down towards the stack to take a large print of paper, it enacts a transformation. Susan Tallman describes this change in her essay, writing, quote, "The act of taking away sheets transforms the object into an addition. It subjects the stolidity of the sculpture to the ephemerality of the leaflet," end quote. The sheet of paper lives a double life as an individual print and as a stack of paper, never completely disappearing even after the installation is gone. Like the candies, audiences take and keep a tangible souvenir of the subject or subjects represented in the work, taking responsibility for its disappearance and reappearance. Again, Freud's definition of melancholia may be used to interpret this repetition as a pathological fixation, or may be seen as Gonzalez Torres' unwillingness and inability to part from the loss of his beloved. However, Hagemeyer argues that the fluidity of the works defies that fixation, writing, quote, "There is no beginning or end, no original or final.
The art is a fluid, continuous process, shifting and growing in time and space, end quote. And that the simple invitation from the artist towards the audience turns the experience into communal mourning. Entitled The End, created in the 1990s, another stack on print on paper, framing the page with a thick black border around the four edges of the paper on a white text-free background. This stack of paper is displayed an ideal 22 inches in height, which each page being 28 inches in length and 22 inches in width. The black border printed on the sides of the paper draws attention towards the empty space in the center, then back again to the border, provoking deeper insight into what the work may mean. Spector notes that, quote, this stack signifies the past that is inexorable to come, end quote, and that the empty space is used for, quote, a projected image of whatever it is you fear losing the most, whatever it is you will want to memorialize, end quote. Perhaps in the making of this work, González Torres was beginning to memorialize his lover before his passing and sharing that fears with others during the AIDS crisis. González Torres has stated that in order to reduce his fears of losing Laycock, he needed to relinquish control over his artwork, saying, quote, I was losing the most important thing in my life, so why not punish myself even more so that, in a way, the pain would be less? This is how I started letting the work go, letting it just disappear. The parenthetical subtitle of The End suggests a somber interpretation to this installation, becoming, as Tallman writes, quote, an all-purpose elegy, memorializing anyone the viewer has loved and lost, end quote. As the audience members take away sheets of paper from the stack, participating in its diminishment, they keep a physical, non-ingestible reminder of González Torres' grief. Once the stack is gone, the pages will become reprinted, subjected to the taking of the audience again. As the stack is gone, the pages will become, as Linda Weintraub notes in her book, quote, the stacks will last forever, either in memories of the victims they memorialize, or perhaps in an eternal afterlife, end quote. Like Untitled Double Portrait, Untitled The End resists finality, but also rejects the Freudian definition of melancholia, avoiding that fixation by transforming the installations for audience participation. Towards the end of her essay, Hagemeyer stresses the importance of queer mourning being different from the Freudian definition of mourning and melancholia, bringing in scholars such as Krim to back her idea. Hagemeyer compares Krim's analysis of the political group ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, to the work of González Torres. ACT UP, quote, advocated for a collective public enactment of mourning away from privatization and silence, end quote, for the queer losses in the community, an action completely defiant from the Freudian definition. Hagemeyer notes that González Torres' dedication to his partner and those who have suffered through the effects of the AIDS virus is, quote, a queer mode of bereavement, end quote, and that his art reinvests loss into the social. Instead of having his grief internalized as a private experience, González Torres externalizes his mourning process. The work of González Torres redefines mourning as a dynamic and collective experience through the replenishment of his ephemeral works and engagement of the audience. His paper stacks and candy spills refuse the fixation and internalization of loss of his lover and instead pivots into a renewal of memory that is deeply intertwined with the queer community. Hagemeyer writes, quote, moreover, as his art mourns losses, it simultaneously celebrates the ephemeral beauty of life. This suggests a vision of mourning as creative and unifying rather than destructive and alienating, end quote. Thank you.
Today, I will be talking about the painter Arshil Gorky. Gorky was born in 1905 in a small village in Armenia and came to the United States when he was about 15, fleeing the Armenian genocide, and became an active painter shortly after. The paintings I will discuss today, made in the summers of 1945 to 1947, are somewhat abstract, contemplative representations of nature and sexual drama. What you will see is neither purely representational nor purely abstract, but tableaus of real sensation and imagery modulated by the process of thinking. Gorky painted his painstakingly composed drawings into palimpsests, which show the regression of connected thoughts back into pure visual stimulus. Situating these regressed thoughts in the framework of the almost neoclassical, the balance of obscured, abstract sexual forms evokes Freud's conception of the dream as a vehicle for desire. Gorky's psychosexual, web-like paintings convey regressive sensation to represent the cryptic and messy processes of the human brain, and thus fulfill the fundamental aim of surrealism to represent the functioning of thought. The paintings capture surreality because they communicate the process of thought regressing into dreams and resemble dreams as they are recalled by the waking mind. Gorky's painting style changed dramatically through the course of his career, reaching its apotheosis in the 1940s. He held art in extreme reverence and cared about little else. Sensitive about his humble upbringing, Gorky often lied about his background and made himself out to be a Russian aristocrat. To compensate for his lack of formal training, he made himself a virtual apprentice of artists who he saw as the new masters, including Paul Cézanne, Pablo Picasso, and Juan Miró. But even Gorky's early imitative work showed the signs of his mature style, ambition, and almost religious devotion to art. Unlike many of his modernist peers, Gorky disdained careless originality. In 1934, upon seeing his new friend Willem de Kooning's drawings, Gorky said skeptically, "Aha, so you have ideas of your own." And according to de Kooning, somehow that didn't sound so good. Though he found modest success, Gorky needed a good push to begin making something of his own. Such a push came in the early 40s when members of the Surrealist movement seeking safety from the Nazi invasion of Paris came to the United States. Surrealism was an artistic movement centered in Paris in the 1920s and 30s, which sought to express an absolute reality through the integration of waking life with the workings of the unconscious. Gorky quickly became associated with artists such as Roberto Matta, André Masson, and Max Ernst. Surrealist leader André Breton recognized Gorky's supreme understanding of the functioning of thought, vision, and emotion, which were essential to his movement. Breton found in Gorky an extraordinary sensitivity to the inner workings of the eye, and along with the other surrealists, pushed Gorky to loosen up a little and allow his unconscious mind to guide his painting. Regression is a psychoanalytic concept which explains how, in dreams, ideas are not thought but experienced sensorially in the present tense, akin to hallucination. This is caused by a reversal of the standard conversion of sensation into conscious thought. In the interpretation of dreams, Sigmund Freud proposes a basic model for thought creation, which begins with sensory stimuli and ends with conscious thoughts and ideas. An attached process occurs behind the main conversion, through which we are able to automatically produce associations between seemingly unrelated subjects. Ideas which are censored by the preconscious are only able to break into consciousness through regressive dreams, in which the thought formation process is reversed, so that abandoned desires latch onto memory traces to express themselves jointly. In a regressive dream, an idea dissolves back into the pure sensation which prompted its development. Because dreams are a form of wish fulfillment, the thoughts which regress into sensation are always tied to a desire. Painted in 1945, Diary of a Seducer evokes Freudian regression in its disfigurement of archetypal sexual drama. Gorky began this painting, along with the others I will discuss, while summering out in rural Virginia, and probably while holding a matchbook in front of his face to construct perspective. With its muted gray palette, it is one of Gorky's few major paintings from this period without bold coloring. Forms are varyingly genital and botanical, and sometimes both. The most obvious example is a composite towards the upper right quadrant, which looks like a phallus adjoined to a flower, painted thinly with a dark gray wash. Gorky kept this composite subtle by rendering its outline only in thin graphic lines. However, he wiped away some of the paint around the edges of the phallus shape to reveal its contours, an instance of what Irving Sandler observed in the artist's practice as, quote, testing every edge and tone for its felt value and structural function. There is unusually extensive documentation of what was stewing in Gorky's mind as he created this painting. To various friends and colleagues, he mentioned that it contained fragments of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang's Odalisque and Grisaille, Jacques-Louis David's Mars being disarmed by Venus, and the landscape of rural Virginia. In Diary of a Seducer, we see the, quote, radical connivance between the figure and desire, which Jean-Francois Lyotard isolates as the guiding hypothesis of Freudian dream work. Quote, the deep matrix in which desire is caught thrives on the mind's abstraction of memory into disordered forms and hallucinatory images. The flat, undulating strokes of pale color throughout Diary of a Seducer resemble a lusty memory of the stretched muscles in both the David and Ang paintings. The yellow-gray, vaguely heart-shaped composite at the center, with the thin inky spot stretching up through its middle, is particularly striking in this regard, appearing like a momentary flex of the back muscles. The densely arranged, interconnected series of sexual forms revolve around the painting's center, like something tantalizing beyond view. Gorky's treatment of the graphic framework here, alternately covered up and exposed, reveals the potency of desire and the regressive nature of painting as a way to work around preconscious censorship. Soon after Diary of a Seducer, Gorky began working on The Plow and the Song, also before the Virginia countryside. He found Virginia pleasantly reminiscent of Armenia, and therefore his mother, who had died during the Armenian genocide. The work's title references artifacts of his childhood. Gorky was fascinated with the form of traditional Armenian plows, and he was known to sing his native folk songs at parties. The Plow and the Song finds traces of memory regressed into erotic, fleshy forms. Gorky made at least 5 versions, though 2 were lost in the studio fire of 1946. These 3 iterations are now in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, Oberlin College, and the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. The Oberlin version is probably unfinished, and most of what you see here is likely underpainting, so it's useful for understanding Gorky's process. All 3 are organized by an almost identical series of thin black strokes, building an interconnected tableau of curved biomorphic forms. With a new treatment of the framework in each version, Gorky pushes certain forms back and forward by applying color in new ways. Here is a close-up of the torso-like composite throughout different versions of The Plow and the Song. In the sketch on the left, it appears less sculptural and erotic, more like intestines. In the unfinished version, Gorky has started to feel out the contours of the body, and the curves which were previously organ-like lumps now resemble breasts. The Chicago version is the most clearly female, with its peachy skin tone and use of shadow, resembling a fractured Greek sculpture. The final version retains the same curves, but Gorky has flattened the color and drawn forward some constituent shapes from the sketch by painting over them in black. Of the 3, the Chicago Plow and Song most resembles a landscape, with its blue sky and appearance of depth. Gorky's skill as a colorist shines through here, as he carefully applies color to create light and shade on many of the composites, which informs the perception of their boundaries. Most of the bottom half is brushed with a pale yellow-green, very flat but still appearing behind or below the composites. It thus serves as a floor for the composition, creating a sense of gravity. In the Fort Worth Plow and Song, the linear framework is abstracted further away from the Virginia landscape. Where the Chicago version has something resembling a foreground, middle ground, and background, Gorky has flattened the composition here by painting over so much of the canvas with a yellow beige. Many of the composites appear less distinct. He reconsiders the boundaries of the forms here, and in the process abstracts them away from the laws of waking life. The change between the Chicago and Fort Worth Plow and Song demonstrates regression. Gorky achieves this by flattening the background, eliminating the blue sky, and pushing back the less erotic forms of the middle ground by making their boundaries fainter. Additionally, the most biomorphic composites appear less like sculpture, as in the Chicago version, and more like scans of body parts. The composite, which resembles a female torso in the upper right, has touches of black, bringing to mind spots on an X-ray or even pubic hair. The Chicago Plow shows the formation of the dream as traces of sensation from the Virginia countryside, collaborating with the dream wish, the association with Gorky's mother, motherland, and fertility of both the land and body, to express themselves jointly. Having lost its resemblance to a landscape, the Fort Worth version uncouples desire from sensation. The next summer, Gorky once again returned to Virginia to draw and paint from nature. In the Orator, he creates a shadowy phallic tableau, which, in its name and composition, echoes the classical and neoclassical art historical canon. Painted in 1947, the Orator has the effect of an interior scene. The composition appears oriented around the form at the center of the canvas. A thin, vertical white form, reminiscent of a mushroom or an ionic column, is connected to a phallic, lectern-like shape shaded in black and orange, the titular orator at his podium. Behind these shapes is a horizontal, segmented composite, which is roughly straight and linear with several bulbous appendages, somewhat like a prone figure lying on his back. In the lower third, there is a group of thin, sharp composites resembling spears or swords laying on the ground, another classical motif. The forms here lean more phallic than in most of Gorky's paintings, maybe reflecting the implied masculinity of the Greek rite which the title references. Here are a few selections from Gorky's sketches for the Orator. He used these drawings as the graphic framework for the final painting, but made some significant changes in the process. All three drawings feature many small, sharp shapes which do not appear in the painting. Both the orator-like and lectern-like shapes were topped with prominent spikes, and the form with the large head, which is absent from the earliest sketch, had an open mouth with pointed teeth. Additionally, the white orator shape had a round appendage around its middle, which is completely absent from the finished painting. These changes between the sketches and finished work further emphasize how for Gorky, painting was a process of regression. The dulling of sharp edges lends a blunt, neutered menace to the scene. The title of this painting may reference the ancient Greek practice of funeral oration, an important rite in which a eulogy would be delivered as part of the funerary ceremony. Some scholars, including Hayden Herrera, interpret the horizontal composite as a body lying in repose with its orange head shown in profile towards the right. This may be related to the worsening of Gorky's cancer, with which he had been diagnosed in 1946. The scene thus takes on a funereal quality. Gorky's mode of painting is like dreaming on canvas. Drawing and painting function like the two prongs of Freud's model of thought creation, the subliminal half of which allows our dreams to express desire through the regression of thought into sensation. Gorky's pencil builds, his paintbrush lays bare. The consciousness grafts the Virginia countryside, which so reminded Gorky of Armenia, as an intestinal composite of lumps, but paint brings desire to the surface. This is how he fulfills the core goal of surrealism, quote, by which one proposes to express the actual functioning of thought. Diary of a Seducer, The Plow and the Song, and The Orator may be understood as adopting a surrealist mode of expression, creating beautiful, sensual, emotional tableaus with nature, but not quite of it. Painting was a process of discovery for Gorky, in which he would utilize his formal intuition to develop feeling between the forms he so carefully sketched in his drawings, in a process of meaning-making akin to Freudian dream interpretation. These developments recall the dismantling of the image figure, which melds together form's edges to create a universal guiding line. I would like to close by reading André Breton's poem, Farewell to Arshile Gorky, which he wrote following the painter's suicide by hanging in 1948. How big you were with your arms opened, your voice was an eagle's nest, when you sang to yourself the old Russian songs. You had received as your share the pure line, more than you knew what to do with, and the heavy net which you were bringing back alone from the depth of ages, in long armfuls mingled the season's charms and the memories. You should have been seen with the landscape, you and the splendid blind man who shadowed you, the figurative and the non-figurative. It's you who crumbled that dry bread. I see you again with your rod of fables, among the stars and the flowering trees. I tear myself from your destiny. How they clung to you, dear Arshile. Ah, he loves fire. Where is his house? Burn it. It and what he keeps in it as evidence of 20 years of disinterested efforts torn away from all that is seen today. You tempt me, damn him, said the ash to the ember. And as if this were not enough, they insisted on putting some of your own red on the spot of the sun of your body. Then, as you were returning, they ambushed you to break your neck, at that most tender place where your fairy child perched, so both together could see further. Who knows if they didn't have more tricks up their sleeve? You had nothing left but to take for yourself the magical death of Gerard de Nerval. How high you are, in the air, less than in what you leave us, less than in your name, aimed at the great storms of my heart. Thank you.